But I'm just going to start with a very brief introduction, and then I'm hoping that he'll share more of his story and background. So Mr. Opio, he is a lawyer in Uganda. Nicholas has been doing human rights work there for over a decade. He grew up in northern Uganda in the Gulu district. So for those who may not know, it was the site of a very brutal, decades-long civil war, and that was the environment in which he grew up. And you can see by his work that it informed a lot of what he decided to do. He went on to law school, and since that time in law school, he's basically been working on issues of human rights through his advocacy, his pro bono legal work, and through his formal legal work. In addition, a couple of years ago, I think 3 years ago now, he founded Chapter 4 Uganda, which is focused on doing exactly that kind of work and sustaining human rights work there. So it's my incredible pleasure to introduce Nicholas Opio, who's going to speak with us now, and I'm hopeful that, as I said, he'll get to share more of his experiences with us. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I was told that when you're at UCSF, you don't mention Stanford. So, in fact, those of you who saw me coming, I had a Stanford chest warmer. I had to remove it. So, but thank you very much for the opportunity to share my work with you. And thank you, Madhavi, Kimberly, Bolzel, Elizabeth, who did all they could to get me here. It almost never happened. But here I am thanks to these wonderful individuals who sent me countless emails. Even if I didn't reply, they kept on sending. As you know, Uganda is 11 hours ahead of California. So because of time differences and an extremely bad internet connection, sometimes communication could be a challenge. But I'm happy that it finally happened and that I'm here today. I've been here since January 11th, and unfortunately, it pains me to say I leave next week, but I have to go. So this evening, I'm sharing with you our work in Uganda, but more importantly, about the plight of sexual minorities in Uganda and the difficulties they face in accessing health services. As many of you may know, Uganda is a country that is now become notorious for, among other things, its onslaught on sexual minorities. This onslaught has a history, and I think it is important to take you briefly through the history of what has happened in Uganda. First, it is important to note that same-sex conduct has been outlawed in Uganda since 1950. In 1950, the British government introduced what they call the Penal Code Act. The Penal Code Act simply outlawed, in very broad terms, what they call having sex against the order of nature. Now, I have no idea what having sex against the order of nature is, and the law doesn't help us as well because it didn't define what was meant by sex against the order of nature. So there was a 1950 legislation that for a very long time remained an idle law on our law books. Essentially, nobody was being prosecuted under the 1950 legislation. And I have no idea why people weren't being prosecuted. But if you look through our court records, up until the end of last year, there was no single conviction under Section 145 of that law. But that also speaks of one thing, that the argument that is used that same-sex conduct is foreign is in fact not true, because when the British came to Uganda, they actually outlawed the practice because they found people with different sexual orientations in our community. But fast forward to 1995, Uganda enacted a new constitution after a brutal and violent past. And that constitution was then amended 10 years later in 2005. And the amendment to the constitution had a couple of things in it. But more relevant to this lecture is that for the first time, same-sex marriage was outlawed in our constitution. Article 31 of the constitution was amended to provide, among other things, that marriage is only between a man and a woman, and that marriage between same-sex was unconstitutional. So that provision was introduced in 2005. And then much later, in 2013 December, Uganda, as many of you perhaps know, enacted the Anti-Homosexuality Act. Now, two things are important to point out. First, that if you look down African history, you look at African literature, look at African culture, dances, systems of families, there is abundant evidence to suggest that same-sex conduct existed way before 1894 when the British came to Uganda, or in fact even before 1894 when the Arab traders came to the shores of the Indian Ocean. So these forms of expressions were not expressly endorsed by society, but people accepted and lived with people who had different sexual orientations. They never had them marry, but they never went after them, primarily because by our own nature, our communities were very accommodative of diversities. The second thing to note is that in 2009, there was all of a sudden a spike in anti-gay legislation. And this has, in so many ways, changed public perceptions in Uganda against sexual minorities. And I've just gotten this to just demonstrate to you the extent of the perceptions amongst Ugandans of sexual orientation. In 2012, a research survey conducted by the group called the Afrobarometer, which covered a period of 2012 to 2014, found that about 98% of the people in Uganda thought that Lgbti people should not enjoy the same rights as any other Ugandan. A subsequent survey that was done and released at the end of last year showed a slight improvement to about 92% of people who thought that persons of different sexual orientation should not have the same rights as any other Ugandan. In fact, they even go ahead and ask whether people thought same-sex conduct was against the culture of the people of Uganda, and the same percentage suggested that it should be illegal because it's against the culture and religious norms of the people of Uganda. So you ask yourself, why then has there been such a rise in anti-gay sentiment on the continent? I have done extensive reading about several countries, and I've come to the conclusion that there are three broad factors that are responsible for the spike in anti-gay sentiments on the continent. And this is really what I think it is. The first one is what I call a democracy deficit. And the second one is the capture of the state by religious groups. And the last one is the emergence of what is now popularly called Pan-Africanism. Now, let's start looking at democracy deficits. In all the countries on the continent where there's violent attack on LGBTI communities, there are also countries that have serious democratic deficits. Serious democratic deficits. Whether you talk about Uganda, that has had a leader in power for the last 30 years, or indeed Mugabe, who is now 92 and sleeping through power, or in the Gambia, where you've had people like Yahya Jammeh, a renowned dictator, who, by the way, that country hosts the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is a very strange irony. So all of these countries that have democratic deficits, you find something common in them. The attempt to find a scapegoat, an attempt to find someone to use to divert attention from their democratic records. This is just a snapshot of the Freedom House World Freedom Index report for last year, showing progress on how these countries have done over the last 4 years. And you can see in those countries like Central African Republic, Mali, the Gambia, Uganda, Burkina Faso, all of those countries have had serious problems about freedom and indeed just in general democratic credentials. So the first problem is simply an attempt to find a scapegoat. And perhaps nothing expresses this point more than what happened in Uganda. Because in 2009, when the Anti-Homosexuality Act was introduced in Parliament, it was introduced immediately after a riot in the city, a riot that saw over 40 people killed at point-blank range by security officials. Some of them were shot through locked doors. And there was a lot of attempt to ask government to investigate and prosecute people who had killed people who were demonstrating. And what did they do? They quickly endorsed one of their MPs to introduce a law in Parliament that took away attention from that incident. In fact, up until now, there has been no investigations or no prosecution for anyone for the killing of over 40 innocent civilians, unarmed and who were demonstrating on the streets. The second reason, really, why I think there is a rise in the anti-gay sentiment on the continent is, and let me just explain, this is a picture that one of our officers took in the recent elections in Uganda. You might think it's a game, but that's not a game. It's a polling station. People are fighting over, a box that was used for putting ballots. So it's a serious contest there. It's not elections. It's a fight. But the second reason really is about what I see as the capture of the state by religious groups. And just to give you some historical context, especially for Uganda, that Uganda experienced a brutal conflict in 1979 when combined forces of Tanzania and Ugandan dissidents overthrew the government of Amin, a brutal dictator. Many of you, at least in the US, remember Amin very well. When the government of Idi Amin was overthrown, the state was extremely weak. The state was unable to provide basic services. And what then happened was that there were parts of the country where the state had no presence at all. Basic services could not be provided. So there was a void. This void was filled very quickly by religious groups who went and did tremendous work of building hospitals, building schools, providing clean water to people in the village, and gaining social capital, becoming very popular. But eventually turned that into a tool to influence the state. And the first thing they had done in Uganda is the HIV/AIDS campaign, where religious groups influenced the state to change their approach to HIV/AIDS from the use of condoms to emphasis on abstinence and being faithful. The impact of which was then a spike in infection rates in Uganda. But the point that I want to make is that increasingly as religious groups capture the state and begin to have a strong foothold on the state, what you see is what I think I term as the moralization of legislation. Laws begin to be passed that tend to talk about moral values, talk about Christian values. And a research done by the US-based group here indicates that in many countries where you have, in countries where people are more religious, there's less tolerance for homosexuality. But that point, and you can see, if you look at numbers in terms of people who are more religious, I think the poor are the more religious, right? And the highest number of people who believe very strongly in churches and what they preach tend to be in areas where there are lots of low-income people. And coincidentally, this also is the fertile ground for intolerance towards sexual minorities. So in Uganda, what happened is that these religious groups turned their otherwise good work of providing services, and began to use that at around about 2007 to preach an anti-gay agenda in Uganda. Essentially, this began by American evangelical groups, led by the now notorious Pastor Scott Lively, who went to Uganda and essentially said three things. One, that homosexuals are after your children. They are sodomites. They are recruiting children into homosexuality. They are enticing them with money, with gifts, with all kinds of things. They also argued that there was such a thing as a gay agenda to rule the world, and that Uganda was the focus of this gay agenda. And the third argument they said was that gay people were responsible for the killing of Jews in Nazi Germany, and that they could do the same thing to Uganda. This campaign, coupled with the strong hold of these Christian groups on societies, became very popular, because if you talk about kids, people are very emotive, right? Became very, very popular. The guy you see there in the picture is Pastor Martin Semper, a very close friend to Pastor Scott Lively. This picture was taken in court on the day the anti-gay law was overturned. He was speaking there to one of our clients, Frank Mugisha, that I'm sure many of you must have read about. But these religious groups in Uganda have a very strong foothold. The unfortunate thing about Uganda is that they have not just foothold or control of the population, but have people who believe in their ethos who are in government. Sadly, some of them also have connections with US senators who have prayer groups and finance them and advocate for them to do what they do in Uganda. The third reason really is what I see as the rise of Pan-Africanism. And this is just a picture of a person I thought was a clown. But that's Yahya Jammeh. Yahya Jammeh is the president of the Gambia. This is a news article from NBC News, which was reporting an AP story, really about the outlandish claim that he could cure HIV/AIDS, cancer, and all kinds of ailments, not using modern science, but using African traditional practice. Yahya Jammeh I think he's one of the African leaders who have championed what they now call as the new Pan-African movement. But this is also related to the fact that at every occasion where their human rights records have been challenged, what they then do is to argue that there's African sovereignty, African value. But in fact, there's no such thing as one single African value or one single African practice, because Africa is not a country, it's a diverse continent. Even in countries, there are lots of diversity. So there's no such thing as an African value, really, to speak of, because there are different kinds of expressions on the continent. So this is really what I think are the three broad reasons that have influenced the anti-gay agenda on the continent. Now let's just come back to Uganda and zero down on what is happening. What is now the situation of LGBTI people in Uganda? First, I think it is important to underscore that the anti-gay legislation that was enacted in 2013 was overturned by the courts. When the law was passed, we challenged that law in court and made several arguments before the court. The argument before the court were in two phases. The first phase was a technicality, really, a preliminary technicality, that during the process when the law was being passed, there was a lack of quorum in Parliament and that they shouldn't have passed the law. And then the second phase was a couple of arguments. First, we had argued that outlawing same-sex conduct was a form of discrimination, which was against our constitution, which was against the East African Treaty, the treaty establishing the East African Community. It's also against the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and several other human rights instruments that Uganda is a signatory to. We also argued, for example, that the anti-gay law provided for, among other things, outlawing of what they call promotion of homosexuality. It was unclear what promotion was. So we said the law in that respect inhibited any person to very clearly know what was outlawed under that section. We also raised arguments about access to health, because if you provided services to a gay man or a lesbian woman in Kampala, there was every chance that you would be prosecuted under the law. So we argued that it's a breach of fundamental human rights, and we had over 19 arguments that we had put before the court. But the court chose the easier way out. The court granted our request to have the law nullified on a technicality. Now, two things are important about that court judgment. It is a good judgment, but also a bad judgment. And here's why it's a good judgment. It's a good judgment because at the time the law was passed, at the time the law was annulled, there were several individuals who were facing prosecutions, primarily because of their sexual orientation, under that law. There were several organizations and entities that had been closed or were under investigations. Now, these individuals and organizations regained their liberty and received temporary reprieve because the law under which they were being investigated was nullified. But the ruling of the court was bad, primarily because the court missed the opportunity to once and for all decide whether LGBTI people have rights in our constitution and whether those rights are protected under our constitution. The court did not address that question, leaving an open window for a possible reintroduction of the law in Parliament. But the court decision itself was not an end, because a couple of things happened after the court nullified the law. The first is that the court, the MPs went back to the drawing board and began to craft a new law. The ruling party, the NRM, appointed a 10-man committee to advise the party on what to do with the court judgment. And what the committee did was to introduce a second legislation, and to draft a second legislation, which was, in text, worse than the first legislation, because for the first time, it attempted to define what was called promotion of homosexuality. And promotion there was defined to include, among other things, provision of services. So if you were a lawyer and you provided services, if that law were to pass, you would be committing an offense. If you were a doctor providing services, under that law, if it were to pass, you'd be committing an offense. But luckily enough, that bill was never introduced in Parliament, because even the people who were drafting it did not believe in it. They never believed in it. They leaked a copy of the bill, and we mounted campaigns against the bill, and eventually it was shelved and never introduced in the House for discussion. But that said, a couple of things are important to note as well. That the problem in Uganda is not the law. As I explained at the beginning, there was a law since 1950. The problem in Uganda is now public perception towards sexual minorities. Public perception towards sexual minorities. Because in every aspect of life, if you are a gay man, a lesbian woman, or even worse, a transgender, or an intersex, you will have completely no space to be free in Uganda. They may not kill you on the streets. That's now very rare. But what they will do every single day is to make your life a living hell. And I'll share with you two stories to just make the point. And this is a story of somebody we had worked with very closely. His name is Albert. Albert used to run a shop in a town called Entebbe, about an hour south of Kampala, the city. He was very popular in the town. They used to call him a designer because he walked like a model on the catwalk, and he made clothes and sold clothes. He was very popular in town, and people would run after him and call him all kinds of names, in praises, really. Albert, one evening, returned home and found that his house had been robbed. Just simple robbery. People broke into the house, stole a laptop, stole an iPad, stole some money. Of course, like anybody else, he reported to the authorities. Their house had been broken into. And the authorities responded and began to investigate these cases. They arrested the people who had broken into their house, and took them to court and charged them for robbery and took them to prison. But in the course of investigations, recovered Albert's computer, laptop, iPad, wallet, all kinds of things. And when they went through those documents, discovered that Albert was gay. That was the beginning of Albert's ordeal, because the case of robbery was dropped. And the robbery suspects were turned into state witnesses against Albert and his partner for their sexuality. Albert was arrested and taken to a police cell. When he got there, he was paraded before the press and told, they told the press he's a sodomite. He's recruiting children in school. So his picture was splashed all over the news media. His address, of his house, his car number plate was made public. And he was taken to a medical doctor for medical examination. And Albert was subjected to forced anal exam in the presence of, according to him, about 15 police officers who all the while were calling him all kinds of names. It included inserting objects and people's fingers into his anus to determine his sexuality. After that, they held a press conference again and put Albert to the press and called him all kinds of names. So Albert was locked up. He was being blackmailed, people were extorting money from him. But eventually, anyway, we got him out on a court bail. But quickly realized that if we had gone to trial with Albert's case, he would have been simply convicted. So instead of going for trials, what we did was to begin to point out to the state prosecutors the inconsistencies in the case, the blackmail in the case, and luckily for us this time, Albert's case was dropped, and the case for robbery was reinstated. But Albert couldn't go back to his home. Albert couldn't go back to his shop. The shop was closed. And we've now had to put Albert in a temporary accommodation in a different town in the country. So Albert's story is the story of every single gay person in Uganda. That's seeking employment, for example. You've got to hide your sexuality. If they know that you are a gay person, they will sack you from your job if you have a job, or they will not give you a job at all. Lesbian women are subject are subjected by their own families in many instances to forced intercourse with men to determine whether they might like it when they quote unquote have sex with men, or like they like to say, if they test men. Transgender people face the most difficult time because of their looks, the physical looks, especially those who are undergoing some transition. The attacks are more violent against transgender people. But what does all of this mean for access to health and the right to health? Because I don't want to bore medical people with legal arguments and legal terms, let me speak to the question of right to health. What does this mean for access to health? To understand what this means for access to health, you've got to go back and look at what happened after the law was passed. And here's what happened. Medical personnel were being prosecuted, were being arrested for simply providing services. And perhaps the most popular case was the case of the Walter Reed Research Facility, which was a collaboration between the Walter Reed Hospital here in the US and the Makerere University Medical School. They were doing HIV/AIDS research with what they call most at-risk populations: sex workers, LGBTI persons, truck drivers, fisher folks. Their offices were raided by the Uganda police force, and they were accused of recruiting people into homosexuality. So 2 doctors were arrested. People's private medical information were retrieved, were put in the hands of the police. As a result, the facility stopped providing medical treatment to sexual minorities. It just simply didn't want to, because they were under investigations, people had been arrested. Nearly 46 LGBTI people who were receiving vital medical services, safe sex education, were receiving condoms, lubricants, now had their information in the hands of investigators who began to extort money from them. The second health facility that was providing services to sexual minorities, which was called the AIDS Information Center, working with people in the slums, simply just stopped providing services because their internal lawyers advised them that they would be prosecuted if they were found to be providing services. So access to health became a very, very difficult issue for sexual minorities. In the main referral hospital, many of you know Mulago Hospital, there was a separate treatment center opened up, which was a good thing in itself, but here's the problem with that it further enhanced stigmatization, became easier for people to know that whoever went to that clinic was either gay or a sex worker. So as a result, not many of them accessed the facility. They had to begin to do what was called moonlight clinics, getting treatment at night when everybody else had gone. But even then, that was risky because you could still be prosecuted if you were arrested. Because if you create another facility, everybody else in the hospital knows that if you're coming out of that place, you're either a sex worker or an LGBTI person. But the clinic existed anyway. Many people began to do night services, which was insufficient for sexual minorities. The third thing that happened was that because of the prosecution of health workers and people who are providing services, the World Bank cut aid to Uganda. $90 million that had been earmarked for the health sector. They just simply withdrew the money and said they couldn't provide money for services that were not inclusive. So the health sector lost $90 million, which was meant to refurbish hospitals, to pay health workers and pay doctors. USAID, which is the largest funder of health services in Uganda, USAID provides in total to Uganda about $750 million every year. And that is even a guess figure. They have no idea how much money they pump into Uganda. Because one hand of the US government gives, but the other hand doesn't know. So, but the rough estimate is that the US government contributes or gives in terms of services and money about $750 million to Uganda, the various initiatives they are involved in. But in specific reference to the health sector, 13,000 workers in Uganda, health workers in Uganda, are paid salary or allowances directly from USAID money. Your dollar money is the one that enables 13,000 health workers to go to hospital and provide services. About 78% of people who are on ARVs do so because of American dollars. So what the US government did was significant, because the US government then began to reallocate resources from organizations that were seen to be promoting an anti-gay agenda to organizations that were supposed to be inclusive and more open and were providing medical services to everybody without discrimination. The problem with that is that while it is different from aid cards, what it did was that there was a window in which about 78% of people living on ARVs were without treatment, as they were trying to find new partners to give them money to be able to provide those services. Many of them had their health records with these organizations from whom funds had been withdrawn, and now had to begin afresh with new doctors. The impact of that was then that many of them suffered, and some of them perhaps even never got back on ARVs. The third thing that then happened was that because of the impact of the law, it became clear that sexual minorities were then an important part of the public health systems in Uganda. In fact, a survey that was done by the Uganda AIDS Commission indicated that in Kampala alone, there were about 10,000 MSMs. Now, MSMs are just men having sex with men. How about lesbians? How about simply just gay men or transgender people? The AIDS Commission found that there were much higher infection rates amongst MSMs than it is amongst the general population, indicating that exclusion of that part of the community has a serious health implication on the public in Uganda. But this problem, notwithstanding, public perception against LGBTI remains starkly negative. So what then have we done in Uganda to try and address these issues? A couple of things. Of course, one, we have gone to court, we have litigated, we have done all kinds of things. Okay, my slide is messed up here. Just a minute. So the first thing that we did was to litigate and sue people who were, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. Sue people who were going after sexual minorities. So a large part of our work in Kampala involved suing individuals every single day for exclusion of the LGBTI community. The second thing that we did was to conduct widespread training of medical workers. Every medical worker or every organization that's receiving money from USAID, including members of staff of the U.S. Embassy, received 1 week training from us. The third thing was for us to work towards guidelines from the Ministry of Health to protect health workers who are providing services to the LGBTI community. Luckily, because of the intervention of USAID and the World Bank, the Ministry of Health issued guidelines protecting health workers from prosecution for providing services, and re-emphasize the code of ethics about observance of fundamental human rights, about the provision of services without discrimination, about confidentiality of the people that they treat. So that the guidelines are out and have been useful to medical workers who are either being questioned or their ethical values were being. Then the last thing we did was to begin to work with sexual minorities themselves to establish their own understanding of their health needs. The result of which has been the creation of a clinic. The clinic, of course, is illegal. It's being run in somebody's garage. But they do have a clinic. The sad thing is that the person who works in the clinic is not a doctor. He is a medical assistant who got a certificate. But they provide basic services. They can give you lubricants, they can test for HIV/AIDS, they can teach you about safe sex and all that kind of thing. So that is really what we did in Uganda. But far from ideal. A lot of work still remains to be done. Those of us who are involved in providing legal services will continue to provide legal services under very difficult circumstances. We suffer a lot of attacks because of the work that we do, but somebody has to step up and do the work. And we are doing exactly that. And when I return to Kampala, I go back to doing exactly that. So thank you very much for listening to me. I will leave the rest for questions.
Start and see what questions people have.
I'm wondering if you have any experience regionally in neighboring countries or other countries in Africa, and if you see this trend in Uganda, if a similar trend exists elsewhere, or if some countries have been moving in a better direction, what your thoughts are on that.
The first thing to note is that there is a general wave across the continent against sexual minorities, whether it is East Africa or West Africa or Southern Africa. There is a wave of anti-gay sentiment. There are a few countries that are fairly progressive in terms of legislation, not in terms of practice and attitudes. I think the first that comes to mind is South Africa. I think it's the first country on the continent to expressly provide in their constitution, even before the US actually, marriage equality. It's in the law. But in daily practice, lesbian women are being raped. They are still facing difficulties. So while their legislation has moved far ahead, people's attitudes haven't changed. The other that I can point to is Rwanda. Rwanda is kind of a closed country. It is perhaps one of the few countries where same-sex relations is not in their constitution. Nobody outlaws it, so you can do what you want. The state turns a blind eye, but the people don't. The people don't. The other country is really, I think it is Botswana. Botswana is more or less like South Africa. But as I said, the problem is not the law. The problem is attitudes and the firm grip of religious leaders over the people on the continent, because they have exploited their vulnerabilities, exchanged their love and support with hospitals and schools and all kinds of things. So the biggest problem is people's attitudes and narratives on the continent.
Just wondered if externally, what, if anything's been helpful? So we know the U.S. evangelicals have not been helpful, but were some of the statements by President Obama and the State Department, or from other places, did those have any impact?
I work very closely with the U.S. Embassy in Uganda. The former U.S. ambassador to Uganda, Scott DeLacy, is a good friend. I saw an article in the New York Times at the end of last year that suggested that U.S. government intervention on the continent had a negative impact. Nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, the New York Times article took the view of a university student in Nigeria and tried to say that was the view of people on the continent, but it's just one individual. I know firsthand the impact of U.S. intervention, at least U.S. government intervention in Uganda. Their intervention was important in changing at least the attitude of the government of Uganda towards sexual minorities. It was because of U.S. government intervention that I can say our case was successful, because the ambassador spoke out openly, forcefully. The ambassador undertook to review all their fundings to agencies in Uganda and make sure that it included services to sexual minorities. So U.S. government intervention has been extremely useful. But that is not to say there were missteps. Of course there were missteps. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is that they were naive at the beginning. They believed President Museveni when he told them privately that he wouldn't sign the law. So Museveni looked at him in the eye and lied to him, and he believed it. I think he was shocked when eventually the law was signed into an act of parliament. That was a misstep. Quiet diplomacy didn't work. But on the whole, the support that the LGBTI communities received in Uganda and still received up until now has primarily been because of the U.S. government intervention. There have also been U.S.-based organizations and entities that have been extremely supportive. The one that comes to mind is a case that we are now working on here in the U.S. One of the American pastors, Scott Lively, has been sued here in the U.S. I mean, a Ugandan lawyer wouldn't sue in the U.S. I have no idea if I could practice here in the U.S. But, a New York-based law firm and a charity called Center for Constitutional Rights filed a suit on behalf of the Ugandan LGBTI community in Boston, in which an American pastor is being sued for crimes against humanity under the Alien Tort Statute. Now, the case was filed in 2012. It's been how many years since then? I thought the U.S. justice system was faster. But that case is important because for the very first time in the U.S., the courts have ruled that persecution on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity amounts to a crime against humanity under the Alien Tort Act or statute. That is the first of its kind in the U.S. I think it is also the first prosecution under that act that is based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But the case is even more important because the pastor that I showed you, Martin Semper, who is right there, who was a very close friend to Scott Lively, we discovered that he's actually an American voter. He's an American registered voter. So the court then summoned him for deposition here in the U.S., to be deposed in the U.S. And in April of last year, when the summons were issued, Pastor Martin Semper has gone into hiding. His church, it's not been at his church. His TV programs, his radio programs that were the primary avenues for his anti-gay agenda off the air. So at least there's some result, even if the case has taken 6 years. But more significantly, during discoveries, the tactics of these American Pentecostal groups have been made clear, because thousands of pages of emails have been placed before the court. And in due time, they might be made public, and you will see for yourselves what American pastors and American congressmen and women were involved in Uganda since 2009. Yeah.
The Quakers have a project called the New Underground Railroad that gets LGBT people into safe houses. Have you heard of that? Is it at all useful?
I have heard about I think they are in Nairobi. I met them in Nairobi in the context of asylum seekers, LGBTI asylum seekers. And we had a discussion about what they were doing and what they could do best. But here is my view. It's a bit controversial to many people in Uganda, but I don't think that asylum is the best way, especially asylum in the US or in Europe or wherever it is. I met the people who have gotten asylum. They find difficulties adjusting here. They find difficulties finding employment, for example, because many of them don't have the skill sets. So I've always advocated for in-country relocation or in-region relocation at worst. And that's the point I made to the people I met in Nairobi, that if you want to help the LGBTI movement long-term, try and relocate people within the country or within the region. Because some of the most experienced advocates and activists, when they leave the country, they actually deprive the movement of their knowledge. But many of them have fled the country. About 400 people are now in Kenya, in a refugee camp called Kakoma Refugee Camp, trying to find their ways to third countries. Because at an individual level, perhaps it was difficult. But my view is that asylum beyond the continent is, in the long term, unhelpful to the movement on the continent.
What is being done, or is there any movement to try to change the attitude of the public? Since that seems to be the most urgent thing. And is anything working to change those attitudes?
Well, it's difficult to know if anything is working at this time. It's really difficult because the amount of work is just enormous. But a couple of things are being done. There are small steps, baby steps. Oftentimes you have to do them looking over your shoulder, afraid you might be arrested. These are the things that that people are doing. First is to mobilize families, because we have realized that if you humanize this debate, you put a human face to it, and people begin to connect at a family level, at a personal level, people tend to change. So we're mobilizing sisters, brothers, and parents of openly, gay people in Uganda to come together and offer a support network. That is very slow because many people are afraid to come out and support their daughters or their sons. But we are working to try and get people's families to come up and speak, because if they do, it will perhaps offer some support. The second thing that is being done is that to address the accusations that LGBTI activism is foreign, we are looking to creative, native means of organizing. Because let's face it, I think we are guilty of copying and pasting Western styles of advocacy. So there's a process to think through creative ways of local organizing that gives the movement a local face, a local feel, and perhaps a local ownership, so that we don't have to be like American organizations, that go to big hotels and have big meetings, or go on the streets to protest, So we're looking into ways of finding indigenous forms of organizing that will make sense to many people. And lastly, what we are doing, at least for us at Chapter 4, is providing safe space to give people the confidence to come up and speak. The resilience of gay people in Uganda is amazing. In spite of all the odds that they go through, a few individuals go to radios if they have the chance. We've paid for several radio programs. We've paid for several TV shows, and people go there and speak up. And when they do, I think that bit by bit it changes people's minds. It worries me when there are no questions. Either I've said nothing or I've been clear.
I missed it, but how is your organization funded and supported? What can people do to support that organization?
First of all, this organization is a legal charity, so we depend on the goodwill of friends across the world who donate money to us, and some of them volunteer their skills. We've had amazing relationships with lawyers across the world with whom we have worked on cases, both in Uganda and now at the East African Court of Justice. So we benefit from that expertise. So if you have an expertise, if you're a lawyer, sometimes we require medical doctors to come and give us expertise opinion. We are right now working on a case to challenge forced annual exams. We are looking for medical experts to give us medical, analysis on the medical value of forced annual exams. The second thing is that, of course, people are giving us money all over the U.S. If you have a check to write, feel free. If you don't, that's fine. But above all of that, and the problem should not be money, it's very cheap to litigate in Uganda. Above all of that is getting people in the U.S. to go to the continent and begin to undo what your brothers and sisters have done. That, for me, is the most important thing. That you have people who mean well, have their hearts in the right places, but are stuck in the Bay Area here, just here and are happy with what's happening. If you really want to cause change, get out of your comfort zone, go there. There are people who would just be very happy to hear you say, good job, keep it up. People who just want to hear you say, that's the wrong gospel being preached. This is the gospel that as we know it. So if you have time, come to the continent. But if you don't have time, send them your support. There are several groups that can benefit from your support. There are several individuals who would benefit from your support. There are people who are going through transition, and because of the lack of proper care in Uganda, have been deformed because they began to take medicine and midway now have lost access. Or the friends used to send them medication for their treatment have now abandoned them, either because they're out of money and people are really in a very bad shape. You could help that small clinic in the garage, send them medication, send them all kinds of literature you might send to help them with their health education. Right?
If people want to ask Nicholas other questions, he has a little bit more time. I know he has another event in a little while, but maybe what we can do is end the formal part of the presentation in just a moment. And then if Nicholas, if you're comfortable with people just coming to talk to you, we can just do that informally as well.
Sure.
So just want to reiterate my thank you to you for actually answering our emails that we sent over and over and over again. You can tell he's very nice. Maybe we were actually pestering him, but no. But I do think that for myself, for Kim, for our team, one of the really important parts of having Nicholas here, other than just his presence and is a reminder, I think, for us that though we spend a lot of time thinking about issues globally at Global Health Sciences and here on campus, and though people do a lot of work outside the United States or with vulnerable populations, that two things. One is that we sometimes don't get a chance to really hear voices from the voices of people that we work with here. And second, that we're not as interdisciplinary as we always want to be. And I think many people have talked about how law and health and social sciences really fit together well, but it's not very often that we really ally with our colleagues in the law. I know there's some, that's not entirely true. I know, for example, there's a UCSF, UC Hastings initiative, and there are other initiatives like that. So I think it's just a really good reminder of both the listening to other voices and also of being much more interprofessional. So, and just being re-inspired every time while you're doing your work. So thank you very much, Nicholas.